a book that you wrote in 1969, Réflexions sur le futur d'Israël.
L'avenir d'Israël.
L'avenir d'Israël. Reflections on
the future.
Israel's future.
Yeah.
What was the nucleus of what you wanted to say in that book?
It's actually it's something I said in that book, and which to this day I unfortunately consider as plausible. The book was written 2 years after the Six-Day War. That is very close to an event which I certainly didn't perceive at the time as totally defining the future of the region and Israel versus Palestinians. All that was not yet clear in anybody's eyes. The book was written in 1968. I remember why it was 1968, because the Russians reoccupied, in a way, entered Prague, as you may remember, the Soviets. And I remember writing this book when this happened. So it was written in 1968, I think published in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, in France. And there I said, that it was not probable that there would be peace between the Arabs and Israel. I then thought I was totally wrong when Oslo came and the sense peace was around the corner, and then it appeared that with Rabin's assassination and so. And I think I explained in the book, as far as I remember, that extremists on both sides would make it very difficult to reach peace. But I said, Israel is strong enough militarily to do a unilateral step in order to save itself in a way, even if this situation were to continue for decades, that is, withdraw from the occupied territories. Because I said, and not knowing all that would come, of course, because I said, if we continue to occupy those territories, we will lose our whole moral raison d'être. We will lose the values which were at least considered as the ideals of a just and democratic Jewish society in that new state. That is, we were strong enough to get back from the territories occupied in 1967. And if we don't do that, out of this expansionist ideology, or whatever ideology, or nationalist or mystical, it was starting at that time, then we lose the basic value sense, which in a way, notwithstanding the fact that we had occupied Arab land by the very creation of Israel, gave a moral sense to that society. And on that, of course, I didn't change my views to this day.
How was that book received?
It was well received in France. It was written in French, well received. There were some critics, but generally well received. Even among French Jews, and I lectured a few times to Jewish audiences, very always attentive, and there was discussion, but positive discussion. In Israel, the book was this book was never translated, and actually it was not received because it's unknown in Israel.
You lived in France at that moment?
In Geneva, and I was just going back to Israel to teach at the Hebrew University. It was 1969. I came back in 1969 to Israel to teach at the Hebrew University. A book which I wrote some years later, the dialogue with two Arabs, Mahmoud Hussein, they write under one name, but there are two people. That's where I said more or less the same things, and I added that one had to divide Jerusalem if one want ever to get peace. That was badly received in Israel, and some people called me traitor. I was a professor at the Hebrew University, and the student newspaper, Piaton, that's the mouth of the donkey or whatever, that's the name of the paper, which was the daily paper of the university students, called me a traitor. And so did, I think, the evening paper Ma'ariv, but never mind. So this was not, one of my good friends told my then wife, this is like, I mean, discussing with those two guys is like talking to Himmler. That, you know, that was 1974. And I then was taken to the hospital with a, with a bleeding ulcer and operated on. And somebody said, well, I understand the tension you must have undergone these days after you published this dialogue and all the attacks. I mean, you know. So I didn't gain many friends by writing that book, but which was, as I said, translated into Hebrew. But I would write the same, not in a different context, of course, but certainly.
Is Israel still in the forefront of your mental activity?
You mean writing about the...
No, what is happening there, the situation between Israel and the Palestinians, is it still something which is
today, nowadays?
Yeah.
Yes and no. That is, as I live in Los Angeles, very far away in many ways from Israel, there is a distance, of course, and I am an old person by now, and therefore everything is toned down. But when I see what's going on, and when I read additional news about the drift of the country of Israel to the right, to a kind of, and towards some renewed religiosity in the national religious sense, nationalistic religious sense, I get extremely upset. And the news come, I don't read only the news here, I read the Hebrew daily papers on the internet. And it is very upsetting, so that the distance, there is a distance because of the geography, and as I said, because of age, toning down, and then I am very preoccupied by my other work. But news of the kind I mentioned managed to get me completely, deeply angry. But, you know, the left in Israel has failed time and again. And Oslo was a moment, I told friends here, you know, I was wrong. I thought there would be no peace. But here we are coming to a peace agreement, compromise, negotiation, peace. And then, and I believe that I was glad, of course, so happy to have been wrong. And it's not the direction things are taking, but let's hope.
So coming back to Israel, this very moment we are in, it's March 2010. The Israeli government, what do you think about this clash with the US at this moment?
Well, it's Unfortunately, it is not posturing. It is the clash. I mean, on the Israeli side, Netanyahu's reasons are clear to everybody. He is head of a coalition in which the right-wing religious nationalist parties have a very strong influence. And if he gives in on the building in Jerusalem, which he personally may be pragmatic about it, although he is certainly very much a rightist, nonetheless, he may, because of fear of the United States or of the ties to the United States, he may pragmatically try to shift things. Basically, he will not change this position, I think, because of the fear of losing the majority, the coalition, and then not being losing power. You see, he's a man who is an opportunist in many ways, and has been so throughout his political career. And whereas Begin was an ideologist to the end, Netanyahu can shift, not to the left, but within the right he can shift and manipulate and get his way somehow, but he certainly likes power and wants to keep in power. And therefore, he has a problem because his coalition is based on the kind of parties which will be ready to go for a confrontation with really the only country that is supporting Israel through and through, the United States. They blindly go against the wall. What will come out of it, nobody knows. He's here or he's arriving today or tomorrow. But he, of course, will have to go in very complicated zigzags in order to keep his coalition, to keep himself in power, and therefore to be intransigent on the building in Jerusalem, and nonetheless not come to a complete clash with the United States, which are vital for Israel.
But what chances does Israel have to reach peace at this moment then?
In my opinion, very little. Very little because the murder of Rabin has shown something, that if you go on the road to peace, there will be enough fanatics in the country to put a stop to it in one way or the other, in that case murdering the prime minister. The man who didn't come from, he came from, theoretically from the left. Achdut Avodah is a Labour Party, let's say, in Israel, part of the Labour coalition. But he personally was not a dove, believe me. And he showed it during the first Intifada. He was pretty harsh about breaking the bones of the demonstrators and speaking pretty harshly about the Palestinians. But the man changed. Rabin changed and understood whether emotionally he was for it or not, but he and Peres, who changed as well, certainly moved to a negotiating position and were ready to give up a lot for peace. And there, Peres is the president, but the president in Israel has a pro forma, personality, has no real power. Rabin, as we know, has been killed, which is, I think, to this day, is a trauma in Israeli society, but that's beyond our discussion. And this shift to the right, this shift towards a kind of mixture of nationalism and religiosity among a segment of the population makes a compromise more and more difficult. And I was already afraid of this many years ago. Among the in the occupied territories, now the West Bank, you have two types of people. You have the settlers, I mean. The settlers are, some of them came because they simply get houses for cheaper rent, cheaper buying, and so on, and conditions are very good. And you have a hardcore, which is really fanatic. And I think that, contrarily to what happened in the Gaza Strip, where the settlers, after all, were not on holy land, if you wish, and therefore could be moved, notwithstanding protests and so on, to move the settlers from the West Bank will be tantamount to a kind of civil war. I mean, I'm overstating it maybe, but something of the kind. And this was apparent already years ago, but now has become really threatening because you have 300,000 settlers again. Maybe 200,000 are there because of cheaper rents, but surely there is a fraction substantial now, and which has weapons. I mean, not weapons which can stand against a real armed intervention, but of the Israeli army or even the police, but nobody in the army. Even in the army, we have a problem. The younger officers come very often from this background, you see. And you see today in the army, young officers, not the higher up, who are come from the religious nationalist background. So the question also is, how far would the army or even or the police really use force to move settlers who would say we don't move? I know that there have been ideas, and very good ideas, to exchange blocks of settlements, right, areas of settlement against territories which are part of Israel, in order to get a kind of compensation, territorial compensation. But I think that for the Palestinians, what is today the West Bank with Jericho and Nablus and so on, and Hebron, there can be no compromise, and Jerusalem, of course. You cannot compromise on those major places. And therefore, exchanging some rural land will not really help. And then there is the problem of the refugees, the repatriation of some, and that will be opposed, I think, by almost any Israeli government for reasons which are demographic. And so to say that we are on the road to peace, ultimately, but how this peace will look is, I am very pessimistic.
But you still think that what the Israeli government should be doing, if it were decent, was go out of the territories?
Of 90% of the territories, yes, of course. There may be discussions about this point and that point for security reasons or for whatever reasons, but it should be minimal. And there was a plan like that in the early 70s, which was called the Alon Plan. Yigal Alon was a very important Israeli political figure. He was of the same party as Rabin had been. He understood more of the problems in the Israeli-Palestinian debate, if you wish, and his plan was to establish Israeli settlements and points of presence in a way which would not hamper the returning of the majority of the main part of the West Bank to the Palestinians. Then, you see, the settlers started also under labor governments to settle in places. Alon died, in places which had not been part of the Alon plan, and slowly they settle in such a way that it becomes very difficult to find the geographic continuity, if you wish, which the Palestinians demand, correctly, of course. So that it becomes, and the infrastructure is built in a way which makes the returning of the territory more and more difficult, the roads and the water, the system of water canalizations or whatever, the electric grid. I mean, the infrastructure is such that a friend of mine way back, many years back, Meron Benvenisti, who was once deputy mayor of Jerusalem, wrote years ago that the infrastructure would make the redivision impossible. Well, today, surely, many decades later, this is even more real than when he wrote it. So there are quite a few people in Israel who are aware of the situation and warn about it. Warn why? Because the question is, can Israel remain a democratic state and at the same time a mainly Jewish state? If you keep the territories and if they are slowly integrated into Israel, this is impossible. This becomes impossible because demographically, within 15 years, I don't remember now the numbers, 20 years, the Arabs will be a majority. So either you, like in an apartheid system, you keep them down and not full citizens, and then Israel is not democratic anymore. And it's Jewish, but not Jewish dominating and not democratic. Or if you want it to be a democratic society, then the Arabs will have the majority in parliament. You see, it's a dilemma which actually should convince the leadership, the Israeli leadership, and many people. I mean, it's a theme which is here every day in Israeli papers. I mean, not that people don't see it. You have to think of the demography. There are almost 1 million, 800, I think it's 800,000, maybe 1 million Arabs which are Israeli citizens, which live in Israel. Add to it 1.5 million or whatever number now in the West Bank, not to speak of Gaza, and you, by any calculation, will have an Arab majority in a country which doesn't give back those Arab parts, let's call Palestinian parts, to the Palestinians. You understand? The problem of the Israeli Arabs will remain, but let's say that this is an internal problem which should, I think, find its solution in a real equality and improvement of the civic and material conditions of the Arabs in Israel, and it has been improving over the years and over the decades. But the global problem seems insoluble if you want to keep a Jewish state.
Okay, let's go back in time. After you wrote Réflexions sur l'avenir d'Israël, you became your relationship to Zionism in Israel developed. Tell me about it and how you got involved in peace. Now, tell me about your development from being a staunch Zionist.
I was a staunch Zionist. I really was, and I will come to the present situation after explaining the beginnings. I came to Israel in 48 on a illegal, although the state had just been created. I came in June 48. State was created in May 15th, 48. I came on an Irgun ship belonging to the extreme right, to the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, which was had been under the British, a right-wing underground army under the leadership of Menachem Begin, who established the Likud and so on. Cherut and then the Likud. I came on this Altalena, although I had no idea of what is what and what they want and I wanted to get to Israel because I was emotionally taken by what was going on, the war before the state was established, the civil war, if you wish, and then the war that started on May 48. And I managed to get on that ship by changing my birth date and making myself older than I was, from 15 to 17. And they took me, and I was among the 900 who arrived in Israel as warriors. And the ship was shot at when we arrived to the coast of Israel, then by the Israeli army under Ben-Gurion's orders, because he didn't want to leave the weapons that were in the ship, plus soldiers, to the Irgun. So the ship was sunk eventually. We had disembarked much before. And the Irgun was disbanded, and I joined my uncle. And I mean, this was the end of my odyssey to Israel. But I remained very staunchly Zionist, emotionally, strongly Zionist, throughout the years of my military service, then even the years I came back to France to study, until the 67 war, where I represented, in a way, the Israeli voice, first in debates in Europe, where I was, in a way, a debater for the strict Zionist position, and then on French television, where there was a clash between Palestinians, 2 or 3 Palestinian representatives, and 2 or 3 Israelis. We sat in separate rooms on the first, the major television program at the time. There were not so many channels in France, and this became a kind of national debate. And so when I, on my way back to Israel to teach at the Hebrew University, the first trip was at the end of 67, I still was very firm. But when I saw the kind of nationalist exaltation which followed the Six-Day War, and many aspects which I found more and more problematic, plus the occupation which clearly was growing, I started changing. And it took years, but I became more and more a peacenik, somebody who was against the occupation. I was not the only one, but we were not very many. And I went to make speeches. I even spoke in front of the Prime Minister's office to a crowd of people who were at the same ideas, but that came later. In any case, I changed. And this change, I wouldn't say I am anti-Zionist, in the sense that I think, you see, today, and I find that very unfortunate, you have on the left, mainly the intellectual left in Europe and here, in the United States, many colleagues who not only on campuses, but mostly on campuses, who denied the legitimacy of Israel as such. That is, the movement, the anti-Israeli movement, if you wish, has gone so far that today it's not the policies of Israel that are really criticized and attacked, which I find totally legitimate. But what you have more and more is that the state itself, that is, the state of Israel, is not really a legitimate state, that it is a colonialist product which in a way should be erased. And that is taboo for me. I mean, I am, in that sense, if you ask me, do I think that the state of Israel is legitimate, notwithstanding the fact, and so on and so forth, I would say yes, but within its limits. And that makes it legitimate. That is to know what your limits are, and we discuss the limits. Now, the very continuation of this situation and the intransigence of Israel over the years, but also the intransigence of the Palestinians to compromises on various occasions, I mean, we should not go only to one side, has added to the inflammatory side of the conflict and has created, or at least not created, but inflamed, exacerbated something new, which is the Islamist hatred of Israel and of the Jews. So that now we have a new situation, which is also exploited for geopolitical reasons by a country like Iran, and so on. I mean, we are all aware of what's going on, so that now we have to think on two levels. Solve the problem of Israel-Palestine, and of course, by solving that, take something away from the wider anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, actually, Islamic movement in its central places like Iran, or in its small peripheries like Gaza or the Hezbollah in Lebanon. So now the moral situation remains, and is even more urgent, but one has also to think, of course, of an existential situation, that Israel is now endangered by the growth and the rapid growth, actually, of something different from what we had in the past, and that is this anti-Western, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, of course, Islamic movement worldwide, actually.